Hi, my name is Michael Parks. My pronouns are he, him, and this video will be about naive art, Untitled Art, and Haiti. Haiti is a country in the Caribbean, and I think before we dive into the art of Haiti, we need to acknowledge the origins of Haiti as a country, because I think their rich history is especially important in understanding where the artists of the country are coming from with their works. As a colony of France, it earned the French tons of money in African slave labor working on sugar plantations. But as a result of the National Convention in Paris of February 4th, 1794, slavery was abolished in France's colonies thanks to the efforts of the enslaved Haitians revolting against them. This was great news for the over 95% of the population of Haiti, which was not white. Unfortunately, later, when Napoleon took over with his coup, he kind of decided, never mind, let's bring back slavery. The Haitians wouldn't just take this, of course. They had already had their promised freedom, so they were not going to just roll over and have that taken away from them. So they went right back to revolting. And incredibly, to make a long story short, they won. The Haitians won both their own and their new country's independence, making them the second country in America to do so. There's something so incredibly powerful here, and it can't be forgotten that this is the strength in history which Haitians have a claim to, and we see this represented in their art, a strength of conviction and self-worth. And an important part of this history is the involvement of voodoo, as the Haitian Revolution actually began with a voodoo ceremony, the bois caiman ceremony, where the enslaved Haitians came together to solidify their part in this revolution, showing just how much tradition is valued and associated with the freedom of Haiti. Now, while Haiti was a French colony and slavery was still taking place there, there were some limitations on the image-making abilities of Black Haitians. But Haitian art history does begin in the 19th century, despite later perceptions that it didn't begin until the creation of Les Art. In the book Les Peintures Haitiennes, their timeline of Haitian art history mentions the first Haitian art school being developed in the 1820s, and at least 30 artists, some trained in France, working in Haiti from the 1830s to 1860s. And as we look forward at Haitian art created in the 20th century, when it began to be better documented with the creation of Les Art, we can imagine that the typicality of style that we see then was perhaps birthed and defined in this earlier era by Haiti's earliest naive artists. I've used that term a few times now. So before we get into the Art properly, I would like to define naive art for you. From Folk Art Terminology, Why It Still Matters, by Joan Benedetti, she writes that naive art refers to art created by non-professional artists or artisans who have not had formal training and are often self-taught, and that it is generally distinguished from, quote, outsider art, which includes the more extravagant, psychotic drawings and other art created or collected according to a philosophy or avoidance of, rather than simply a lack of traditional training. And in Howard Risatti's A Theory of Craft and Function, he contrasts naive art to other types of primitivism with the statement that work intentionally made to appear naive is another matter. Such works adopt a pseudo-naive style as an intentional reaction against the polished realism of academic tradition. With these definitions, I find it very interesting how naive art in Haiti is generally tied to an institution, Le Centre d'Art. Le Centre d'Art was founded by American watercolorist DeWitt Peters in 1944 while he was, as a conscientious objector, working in Haiti for the U.S. government as an alternative to war. He was enamored by Haitian art and sought to build an establishment with the help of the Haitian government and Haitian artists such as Hector Hyppolite and Philomé Obin to empower and help educate Haitian artists further. The artists working at this time had a developed style of rich, saturated colors and flattened pictorial space. Their works depicted carnival, genre scenes of daily life, and plenty of stylized portraits, alongside references to voodoo and tropical fruits and landscapes. I feel in these works there is such an attention to the artistry of it. These artists may be disinterested in the perfection of technical skill of academic art, but are more focused on the goal of creating works with heightened aesthetic and emotional appeal. Through experimentation, their use of color is beyond compare. Rich reds, greens, blues, as well as a wonderful use of neutral colors. These artists clearly knew what they wanted to do and were experts in the execution of that goal. As these earlier artists were not generally formally educated, they fell under the label of naive art. So where does the school come in? The opening of Listan Tada was a benefit even for those artists working within their own developed style. It allowed Haitian artists access to more tools and materials and allowed them space to work and grow together. When looking at later artists of Listan Tada, while still looking at the mid to late 20th century, such as Gesner Abelard, Jasmin Joseph, and Alexandre Grégoire, we see similar uses of color and that flatness of pictorial space, and a similar focus on the expression of the work as the earliest artists had had. There is something very Haitian about these works that hasn't been lost with the centralization and education of an art school. This is the style that is then earning the label of naive, regardless of whether these artists are being trained at Listan Tada. I would argue that in Haitian art, the naive style has its own meaning that isn't specifically connected to a lack of training, but instead to the expression of the artist's work. This is different from pseudo-naive movements in the same way that European works representing Haiti are different from Haitian works representing Haiti. These new naive Haitian works are reminiscent of the primarily self-taught artists that came before them. While there isn't a hard, consistent list of stylistic rules, Haitian art has its own feeling that reflects the people who have fought hardship against hardship, from their roots as a country built from a slave revolt to the country's continued struggles with poverty and environmental hardships. Many people note that in Haitian art there's a certain type of joy and perseverance to it. Like, you can see that history in every single brushstroke. There's a rawness to Haitian naive art, and it doesn't speak to an untrained artist, but to a different eye who doesn't deny the technical skills required to create art that would be considered academic, but is merely focused on something else entirely, on a whole different scale, completely unconcerned. Listan Tada fell physically to an earthquake in 2010. It reopened in a temporary space in 2014 and has been back at work on its mission to, quote, find, educate, and mentor Haitian artists, identify talent, enable creation, and circulate it for the benefit of the entire art world, as well as document and display Haiti's significant visual arts heritage, offer quality access to Haitian art to both the public and professionals since. One of the center's last exhibitions before the COVID-19 pandemic was on an associated artist, Tessa Mars, who at times has taught at the school. Though she was trained in France, and you can see that influence in her more thoroughly rendered bodies and faces, you can also see all the signs of the traditionally naive Haitian art, with a similar use of color and composition in her work. This shows the variety that can be achieved in this Haitian naive style, and how Haitian artists who could otherwise be called academic artists still continue to work within it to this day. I think that that's one of the most interesting and compelling parts of this topic. Many of the artists get labeled under this label of naive artists, and I think some who might not be, such as Tessa Mars, are actually still working within the same sort of stylistic tradition. And that's why I think that we should be reassessing how we use labels such as naive art, because clearly it does have a meaning here that does stem from self-taught artists who were doing work before this prominent art school had been created. But it was through the appreciation for their art, which is being labeled under naive, that this institution was actually built from, that we see even French academically trained artists working within, if they're coming from that Haitian viewpoint. And so I would strongly encourage you to go out and look at some Haitian art. Keep this in mind and really think about what you think of words like naive art and primitivism and pseudo-naive art and folk art, and how you categorize these things, and how much terms like these can take away artist intent or presume artist intent. Thank you so much for watching. My sources will be linked in the description box below, including all of the image sources. Unfortunately, with Haitian art, while renowned, it is kind of hard to research. High-res images aren't always on hand, and at times I was struggling to find a source other than Wikipedia to research from more deeply. Thankfully, the Center's collection was saved by the team working there in 2000. Thankfully, the Center's collections were saved by the team working there in 2010. And since 2016, they have been working on digitizing and cataloging their 5 collections to help further their goal of promoting Haitian art. Of course, their website will be linked with the sources below, and I would implore you to keep an eye out to see some more works from there. They have quite a few iron sculptors working with them right now that are under their artist page, who I think are pretty interesting, but just not really relevant to the research of this video. But I would definitely give them a look. They are doing some very interesting things with metalwork. And finally, thank you to Remy Poindexter, my instructor at Brooklyn College this semester, teaching Caribbean art history, without whom I would not have made this video, because it is my final project. More seriously, Caribbean art history is such a rich and interesting part of art history that really is underrepresented, and I'm glad to be taking part in the study of it, even if only for one semester during my undergraduate. Also, a big thank you to the whole class this semester. I've loved hearing what everyone's had to say. Thank you guys, and yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed this video, getting to look at some beautiful paintings and discuss this wonderful topic of Haitian art, Gesner Abelard, naive art. Have a great day.